By 500 BCE, during the spring and autumn period of China, armies have begun to favor the sword and shield as weapons at war compared to the spear and dagger axe. Two famous regions for their quality of swords were the southern states of Wu and Yue. Swords in this period were made out of bronze and were around 50 centimeters. Any longer than that and it will break. Many kings wielded powerful swords of legend, and just like in Anglo-Saxon England, the practice of naming their swords Haverons. For this video, we will cover 7 of these legendary swords and leave the rest for next time. The first legendary sword is Chunjun, also known as Purity. Chunjun was the second large blade, crafted by master craftsman Oye. When King Goujian of Yue presented it to Yuejue, an expert at evaluating swords, Yuejue suddenly seemed to collapse. He wobbled as if terrified and went down the steps in deep thought, arranging his clothes that he could sit and look at it. His hands trembled and shook, clasping together like a peony. Chunjun shone like a row of stars in a constellation. Its surface was pure as the waters flowing over a dam, its cutting edge as sharp as a razor, its composition as lustrous as ice crystals. Chunjun was found in 1966 in Hubei province. The blade fitted its scabbard perfectly and created a vacuum that prevented the blade from rusting, preserving it perfectly even after 2,000 years. Today, it can be viewed at the Hubei Provincial Museum. Our second blade is Zhanlu, translated as black. Zhanlu was the first sword made by Oye and is said to be the finest sword ever created. It is made from the finest of 5 metals, the essence of fire, and it transmits its Ti and embodies numinous power. When drawn, it shines. When sheathed, it remains awe-inspiring. Zhanlu was so coveted that the king of Qing raised an army to attack Chu over its possession. It is said that Zhanlu watches the behavior of its owner, and if its wielder ever goes against moral principles, the sword will leave its owner and his kingdom will fall apart. When King Helu of Wu failed to behave with moral integrity, Zhanlu left his hands and ended up with the king of Chu. The third blade is Yuechue, the Great Destroyer. Yuechue was said to be able to pierce bronze cauldrons and smash iron pots until they are completely grounded down to powder, hence the name the Great Destroyer. King Goujian of Yue said that when Yuechue was first made, a member of his harem was crossing in front of him in a chariot, driving a team of 4 white deers. The driver suddenly lost control of his deers, at which point the King Goujian drew his sword and pointed at them, and the 4 deers reared up, despite being free from their harness. Our fourth blade is Yuchang, known as fish belly. It is a short blade made by Oye. During a banquet between Helu of Wu and his uncle King Liao of Wu, Helu hid Yuchang in a cooked fish and waited for it to be presented. Once the fish is served, Helu drew the sword Yuchang from the fish belly and stabbed King Liao. Yuchang was able to pierce the king's Chang'e armor 3 times. Being responsible for familicide, Yuchang was henceforth known as an unlucky sword and was used as a burial object. The fifth blade is Longyuan, also known as Dragon Gulf, named for its shape resembling climbing a high mountain and looking down into a deep gulf. King Goujian of Yue once used Longyuan to execute an innocent person by cutting a gash in his thigh, leaving him to bleed out to death. The sixth blade is Taie, the Great Riverbank, named for its majestic and vigorous patterning. Like the waves of a flowing river, the king of Chu led his armies with Taie in an attempt to break out of a siege by Jin. The moment the blade was drawn and pointed at the enemy, Jin soldiers were frightened into disarray and massacred to a man by the Chu forces. The seventh blade is Gongbu, translating to artisanal display. It has a pattern like ceaseless flowing water, rising to the spine, which then stops, like poles that can only hem a garment. Let's take a look at the historical background. Ancient bronze swords typically do not have a long shelf life. We even have a text on the proper handling of swords from the period that quotes a little bit like an instruction manual. If you test them on flesh, they cut apart oxen and horses. If you test them on metal, they cleave bowls and basins. But if you place them on a pillar and strike, they would be broken into 3 pieces, and if you position them on a stone and hit, they will be crushed into hundreds of bits. The kingdoms of Wu and Yue were famous sword-producing regions, with quantities and qualities of excavated swords far surpassing their northern counterparts. This is consistent with the southern preference for close combat fighting styles compared to longer-range battles in the north, reflecting the difference between infantry fighting as opposed to chariot-based warfare. But what about the historical accuracy of sword legends? Like the great destroyer Juque, said to be able to ground iron into dust. It pains to say that the legends were probably untrue, but the swords probably did really exist. Firstly, it is incredibly hard to date the sources of text that mentioned legendary swords. Second, there is a lack of mention of these legendary swords in other ancient texts from the period, making it difficult to cross-reference these legends. And lastly, many of the stories told don't exactly match up to the historical context, like how the sword Zhanlu could travel from Wu to Chu via the state Qin, suggesting that the authors had no idea where Qin was in relation to Wu and Chu. However, it is perhaps more interesting to examine the strategic purpose of these legends. They were derived exclusively from the south, which in the eyes of the northern states became a land of myth where swords swim through rivers to find their rightful owners and women duel men in forests. Their legends helped to affirm the high status of their wielders, and their stories helped to feed its perceived importance and quality. By the time stories of these legendary swords have reached us, enough time has been given to embellishments of romance and fantasy to capture the popular imaginations of future generations. For more information, check out Chapter 13, The Record of Precious Swords, in the book The Glory of Yue by Olivia Milburn. Thank you.